we are here. So you've made it to recognizing and regulating workplace distress through the window of capacity. And so our presenter is wonderful. Her name is Cambria Walsh. She is an LCSW. And on the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit more about her. So, Cambria Walsh, LCSW, is a consultant, trainer, and founder of Rise and Revitalize, supporting well being for helping professionals. With over 20 years of experience, she specializes in trauma informed care, organizational health, and secondary traumatic stress. She is affiliated with TEND Academy and has contributed to national initiatives including NCAC's STS Blueprint and UK-wise STS Solutions Center. Cambria is also a founding member of the Secondary Traumatic Stress Consortium. So, with that being said, and giving you all the goodies about Cambria, I will go ahead and turn it over to her.
Thank you so much, Casey, and
You're
thank you
welcome.
for having everything so well organized and getting us on the right footing here as we start today. Welcome, everybody. I'm so excited to be here. Um, that's such a nice formal introduction, and then I'm like, oh, that's me, right? But I want to tell you a little bit more about what brought me to this particular work, because I think it's really relevant and it really speaks to kind of why my heart is in this work and where my passion comes from. So I spent almost 20 years actually working at Chadwick Center, which is where CalTrin is located. First as a mental health therapist, and then doing a lot more of kind of national and state work. And when I was a therapist and I started, I didn't get any training in graduate school that told me about how this work would impact me. Honestly, when I first started the job, there really wasn't a lot of onboarding that said, oh, by the way, this is going to be kind of a challenging job, and there may be times that you're taking this work home with you or that you're thinking about what's going on during the day and the after hours, and here's some things you should do, right? I didn't get a whole lot of support around that because back in that day we didn't know better, first of all. It wasn't really on the radar of agencies. And we didn't know as much about kind of what to do in that. And I think we're getting better. I will say we still have a long ways to go. This is a journey, not a destination in terms of really making sure that there's good well-being going on within organizations. But things are getting better. We're definitely getting closer. So about 5 years or so into my time as a therapist, I was doing a co-training with a colleague of mine. We were becoming TFCBT trainers, and she had gone through the training before me. So I was kind of, it was the, do one together, learn kind of situation. And so she had put together the training, and I was assisting her with it. And at the very end of the training, like literally the last 5 minutes of the training, there was this piece in there around secondary traumatic stress. And that was really the first time that I ever heard those words, that I ever, had been introduced to that term. And I read the couple of slides on it, and I was like, this is really fascinating. And oh boy, can I relate to this? Like, this is what I've been feeling. It's so wonderful to have words put to it. And even back then, it was more, this is what it is, and not a lot about, well, what do you do, right? So fast forward a couple of years, I made the decision that was something I was really interested in and spent a lot of time thinking about it and kind of delving into what literature was out there about it. And Chadwick Center, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is a child advocacy center, but it's located within a much larger pediatric hospital here in San Diego. It's part of Rady Children's Hospital. And I started doing work within the hospital with hospital staff, right, and healthcare around what does this mean to look at how you're being impacted by the work. And so I was doing things in the broader hospital. Ironically, right kind of in the midst of that work, within the first year of my doing that work, I got pregnant, and I got pregnant with twins, which is always a high risk pregnancy situation. And I will preface this by telling you that this has a happy ending, right? I don't want to trigger anybody or have a horrible emotional reaction to things. But what happened for me when I had my twins, because it was a high risk pregnancy, I delivered early, and one of my twins, about 10 days in the NICU, which was at a different hospital right down the road from ours, developed a condition that required him to be transferred to the NICU at Rady's. And so here I was as a family member, right, as a mother with my child in the hospital where I had been training all of these people about it. And I had this whole kind of shift in my thought process and my understanding about this because I realized that not only is it important for the staff themselves, right, to be in a place where they're feeling supported and that they're addressing and they're having real conversations about how the work is impacting them. But as a parent, I was like, I do not want the next person coming into my child's room still carrying what they just came from, right? I want them to be able to have the skills. I want them to be able to have the space, the support, to be able to move from one difficult situation to another and really be present in what's going on with my child. And so as I watched the nursing staff and the respiratory techs and the doctors, right, and all these healthcare professionals coming in and out, I was really struck by when we focus on the well-being of the workforce, it's so important for the workforce themselves, but it also really is important for the people that we serve. And sometimes I think for those who are working in fields where they're like, but I'm doing this because I really want to help, right? And I'm doing all of this because my heart is in this. It's important to remember that for your heart to really be in it and for you to really be doing the most effective services that you have to be looking at how you're being impacted by what's going on. So it really shifted my kind of perception of that as I looked at that into this realization that it isn't just good for the workforce, it's also really important for the organizational mission and the service users that are being served by the workforce itself. And so that continues to kind of shape a lot of my thought process and a lot of the work that I do now. So this is the title again. You already got to see that. My contact information is on here. I'll put it up again at the end. I have a website and I have an email, and I am more than happy to follow up with folks after the presentation. This is really my area of passion, and I love continuing to have conversations about it. So our learning objectives today, we're going to talk a little about what are some of these occupational stressors that go on within workplaces, and what you will hear me often refer to as trauma-exposed workplaces, and really differentiating between secondary traumatic stress, burnout, and moral distress, which are kind of our three big occupational stressors that we see. What are some of their signs and symptoms? And then really looking at how do we address those, both individually, but you're also going to hear me talk a lot about this is not just an individual issue, that it is an organizational issue and it's also a societal issue, and that there's a role for each of these levels to play. You will learn at least 4 techniques to address secondary traumatic stress that you can use for yourself or that you can advocate for within your organization. And many of the individual strategies, I will say, work a lot better when you have an organization who's on board and really supporting that. And then our final learning objective here is really to be able to identify 2 ways that you can look at this support and really think about this support in terms of supervisory support, and what does this kind of look like within the organization. So we want to look at how peer support and how supervisory support play a really big role within this as well. So we're going to put up a poll here. So my wonderful supporters here will put our poll up. I want to get a little sense of who's in the room today, because that helps me know a little bit who I'm speaking to. So if you don't mind quickly filling out this poll and tell me what kind of is your role within your particular organization. And those of you who are putting other, and I know that some of us don't fit cleanly into these categories, if you don't mind throwing in the chat kind of what that role is so that I have a sense of who our others are here. And we have quite a group of others, so that is always interesting for me to kind of see where people identify themselves. So case managers, other kind of frontline folks, technical assistants, resource specialists. Yeah, there's lots of different roles that people play within organizations. Somebody who's in here who's an attorney, wonderful. Clinical social workers, employment specialist, case managers. So lots of different roles that you all kind of embody here. And I think the reason that I ask this is for me to get a sense of the room, but also to remind ourselves that everybody plays a role in kind of looking at this, and everybody is slightly impacted slightly differently in the organization by what's going on and has a different role in terms of how to impact things, right? So it's different if you are a trainer and you're going out and you're supporting other people than it is if you're a leader, than it is if you're a frontline worker. And we don't want to forget the folks who are on, like the support staff who are out there also supporting folks. Often in the organizations, those are the people that I see who get the least amount of support, right? A person who's at the front desk who's saying, I'm the one talking to all these clients as they're walking in, or I'm talking to them on the phone and I'm being impacted by this, and I got absolutely no training on how to do this. And so we want to make sure that we're really thinking about everybody and kind of the impacts that are going on within the organization. So especially for those of you who are in leadership roles, keeping that in mind, right? And really paying attention to the fact that it's not just your kind of more obvious direct service staff, but it's everybody in the organization, even people who are in an operational role. I was working with an organization the other day, and the CFO was on the call, right? And so he was talking a little bit about what it's like in his role, that he wants to make sure that he's interacting with staff in a way that isn't causing more stress for them. And so understanding what they're going through really helps him in how he interacts. It deals with some of the conflict pieces that may come up. All right, so we'll move our poll out of my way here so that I can see you all again. All right, so I just wrote an article about this on LinkedIn, and anybody who's on LinkedIn, I really welcome you to come and follow and connect with me. As I said, I love learning from different people, kind of what the challenges are, what their needs are, and how I can continue to support people. But I wrote this article the other day on rethinking the empty cup metaphor, because I was seeing a lot of folks, and I've seen this over the years, but just recently on LinkedIn, just noticing a lot of people talking about, well, you have to fill your cup before you can help others, right? And yes, that's very, very true. But I think we also need to take a step back from this and we need to think a little bit about what's going on. If we ourselves are the cup, right, and we need to fill our own cup, what's going on around us that may be impacting our cup? And a lot of times when we're within organizations, there are things that are happening within the organization that may be causing some of these fractures in our cup, right? It's not just the service users and all of the emotional content that we're coming into contact with, but it's what does it mean to be in an organization where that's the main focus and that's your main clientele, right? And if you're working in an organization where there's very little support around that, your cup's going to start kind of having some of these small fractures and cracks in it that may grow to be bigger cracks because you're not getting the support that you need. Or in some cases, folks are working in organizations where the organizations themselves are having policies and doing different things that's causing your cup to kind of wiggle and be all over the place, right? And then it's really hard to fill it. We also shouldn't be having to fill our cups by ourselves, right? So even when we have a cup where things are stable and steady and there's good supports around us, we should also be getting support in terms of how to fill that cup. So yes, we need to fill our cups. Yes, we need to have these strategies ourselves individually, but we need to look at how they fit into kind of the bigger situation in terms of where we are working and what's going on in the bigger kind of society around things as well. So you hear me talk a lot about this in terms of a trifocal approach and this idea that we have to look at all these different levels. So the first one is individual, and that's what we can do ourselves, right? That's where our awareness is about how are we being impacted by the work, what's impacting us with the work, what are the unique strategies that work for us? Because one of the things that you will learn through our time today is it's not a one size fits all. So what works, for the person down the hall from you may not be what works for you. And so you want to make sure that you are really tuned into what your needs are and that you are tuned into what impacts you so that you can best take advantage of the strategies and the supports that are out there. The organizational level, again, is this idea that, organizations, in some cases, just the mere way that they're designed can be difficult for people to work within, right? The workloads, the expectations that come, the supervision or lack of supervision, right? There's lots of different organizational factors that impact how we are impacted by the work that we're doing. And so organizations have to be a big piece of this puzzle and have to play into this because you can do everything right on your own. But if you're working in a system where you're not truly being supported, that's going to be exhausting. And that cup is going to keep having these kind of little holes that go in so that no matter what you're pouring into it, you're not going to feel like that's staying and it's working for you. And then I also think that the societal level is an important one for us to talk about as well. And where this comes in, and this is something you don't always have a lot of control over, but that organizations can certainly advocate for, and that I think individual voices that we need to advocate more for. And that is an understanding of society about the work that you all do, right? That we all do, and the value of that particular work. And what we see is that when society places more value on that, and has a better understanding of what that work is, then we can start looking a little bit about, well, how does that then impact what's poured into organizations to support the individuals, right? So I hear lots of folks in nonprofits in leadership, talking about the fact that, here we are, we're writing another grant, and it's all about direct services. It's all about how do we fund the services themselves, and there's no room in there to support the infrastructure that surrounds those services. And the biggest infrastructure when you're working in a human service agency is your staff, right? That's who you need to be able to have that support for. But there's rarely lots of money floating around out there to support that staff. And so the more that we can talk about this, the more that we can really, continue to make this known, I think the better it's going to be for us as individuals, the better it's going to be for organizations. And really, a lot of times that comes down to some of the economic arguments of, if we have all this turnover and our staff are leaving and we have to retrain them in these practices that came in from this grant in the first place, that's not cost effective for anybody, right? So there's lots of pieces to kind of look at around that as well. All right, so let's talk. Oh, I just made it zoom instead of moving to the next slide. All right, there we go. So let's talk about some of these occupational hazards in trauma-exposed work. So the first piece in here is around workplace stress, right? And this workplace stress can happen in any type of workplace. When I was working in mental health, I remember many conversations with my colleagues where we would sit around and talk about what is our dream job, right? If we weren't doing this particular work, what would we want to be doing? And the top answers that came out were working in a florist's and arranging flowers, or working in a coffee shop, probably because people wanted to actually get free coffee, right? But even in those types of workplaces, there's a lot of stresses that can happen. There can be unrealistic expectations. There can be situations where you don't have a lot of control over your tasks or your work environment, where you may not feel very recognized for the work that you're doing, where there may be team conflicts and things that are going on, a lack of psychological safety, where people don't even feel like they can talk about kind of the things that are going on within the workplace that don't feel safe to them. Harassment, inequity, discrimination, right? All of these things can happen in any sort of workplace. And those are the types of things, when we look at them, that lead to burnout. And so that's the first occupational stressor that we look at here. And when we think about burnout, burnout really is the result of long hours, not having a lot of resources, having a real lack of control and disconnection from other people, right? And so that burnout piece can happen in any sort of line of work. And I see it all over the place, right? Lots of different organizations, corporations, are talking about burnout all the time. People also often talk about things that are burnout that aren't really burnout, right? That are related to other things, and it kind of becomes this umbrella term, which is why I want to dig in a little bit more to some of the other pieces that we see more specifically happening in trauma-exposed workplaces. And again, a trauma-exposed workplace is any workplace where you're working in a human service sector, where part of the focus of your work is to support people who've been through traumatic circumstances, very challenging circumstances, right? And so we see that in healthcare, behavioral health, child welfare, education. We see it in a lot of the first responder types of occupations. We see it in victim advocacy and child advocacy types of occupations, right? And many, many others, but those are just some examples of those, what we mean when we talk about those types of workplaces. The second piece that we see in here is a lot of systemic and regulatory pressures that go on. So this is both the internal and the external structural demands that shape and constrain the workforce. So this is things like having really tight turnaround on things, persistent productivity pressures, not enough staffing, the lack of resources or tools to really be able to do the work and do it effectively. Scarcity. So I hear a lot of organizations talking about, there's waiting lists when we have to refer people out. There's huge waiting lists, and then that impacts the work that we can do within our organization. There may be policies or mandates, and we're seeing that a lot right now in the United States because of what's going on with a lot of the executive orders. So I'm constantly hearing from folks, this idea of like, this is not what I signed on to. This is not the work I want to do, but I have to abide by these particular orders because that's what the organization has to do. And that's really in conflict with my values and making it really difficult to do the work in the way that I feel like it needs to be done. Leads to a lack of job security. So, even some of that has led to jobs disappearing, rifts, lots of changes in terms of how organizations are actually doing the work. And then this sense of constant change or uncertainty. So in that respect, what we see is this idea of moral distress. And moral distress is when you know the right thing to do, but you can't do it because of some sort of external constraint. And that external constraint is an external constraint to you as an individual. So it can be something at the organizational level, or it can be something at the larger systemic level. What happens in a situation where there's moral distress? So I'll give you an example is if you're working as a therapist, and I'll use that because I'm most familiar with that world. But if you're working as a therapist and you're working in a child serving system and you have real concerns about a child being returned home, but it's not your job to make that decision, right? That's not up to you as a therapist. It's in the hands of another system that makes that decision. Um, and you're super concerned about it. You're worried they're not going to be able to tell somebody if something unsafe happens, but you have to let go and you have to let the system play out because it's not your job to do that. Yet that brings up all of this um, emotional reaction for you because you're really, really worried about this. So that's what moral distress is. Now, what can happen along this continuum is you can move from moral distress to what's called moral injury, which is where there's a deep psychological, emotional, or spiritual challenge that results from an action or an inaction that really is in violation of your values or in violation of your ethical code. And so this is something that has been long talked about in healthcare and nursing is kind of where moral distress and moral injury came from. They've been talking about it since the 1980s. More recently, in some of the more behavioral health and other adjacent fields to healthcare. But we're really starting to look at this and understand, the ramifications of what happens both with moral distress and moral injury. So moral injury is more of a lasting issue. Moral distress might be it's this one-time concern that I've had, and then I've moved on, and there's lots of other things that I'm focused on. Moral injury is kind of this ongoing challenge that's going on with it. So in the example that I shared before, that therapist is seeing all the changes in this particular child since they've been sent home. They have a lot of continue to have a lot of concerns about safety. And they start to lose faith in the system because they're seeing this kind of negative piece play out, right? And that is that long lasting piece that happens with moral injury, where it's not just kind of this one time distressing incident, but it's this ongoing lack of trust that starts to happen when we look at the more systemic pieces and this kind of deeper distress that happens. And we see this happen in all sorts of fields that are trauma exposed now as well, not just healthcare, as I've said, not just mental health. And then the final area in here is trauma exposure. And this is either the direct exposure to trauma. So it can be, especially for those who are in first responder roles, that there are traumatic events that are happening to you in the line of work. And these are things that are very unique to trauma exposed workplaces for the most part. You're not going to go in and on a daily basis regularly have that happen in other types of corporations. But in trauma exposed work, the direct exposure can happen more frequently, as I said, in first responders and those who are out in the field, home visitors who are going and visiting in dangerous neighborhoods, right? There's lots of different circumstances that can put you in that kind of direct exposure. It can even happen if you're working in a clinic situation and you have threats that are made against you and concerns about, somebody who's going to come in and do you harm. What we see much more frequently, however, in trauma exposed organizations is the indirect exposure, right? And that's where we're hearing about the details of what's happened to somebody, or we're seeing kind of the impacts on them. So we're seeing a lot of the behavioral challenges or other things that have happened as a result of somebody having firsthand trauma exposure. We, as the second hand, are kind of intaking that and trying to support somebody through some of these difficult situations. And that's what can result in secondary traumatic stress. And so secondary traumatic stress and primary traumatic stress here, if we look at primary traumatic stress, that's the psychological and physiological response when you directly experience something, whereas secondary traumatic stress is the emotional duress that results when we're exposed to the firsthand trauma experiences of somebody else. And it's not just experienced by those who are on the front line. Others in the organization are certainly impacted by this trauma exposure as well, right? So supervisors hear about it in supervision. We certainly see, it may impact how people are acting toward each other, and we'll talk about that in a moment as we get into some of the signs and symptoms of what's happening. But then it starts to impact the organization as a whole. All right, so that's our foundational piece of kind of understanding what all of these different stressors are. We now want to move into what do we do about this, right? How do we address these hazards? So, in the model that I've created through Rise and Revitalize, I talk about this at three different, I call it the ABCs here, right? The awareness, your building skills, and your connection as three pieces of this puzzle that we really need to put together in order to be able to address what's going on. And the first one is awareness. And this is very foundational because if we don't know what's impacting us, what's at the root, or we don't know how it's impacting us, it's a lot harder to find the right strategy to address it. So knowing the signs of burnout, burnout is characterized by three different things here. The first is exhaustion. And that's the one that people most relate to, right? That's the one that's most obvious is people are just emotionally exhausted. They're feeling crispy. They don't want to do anything more, right? And so that's usually the first major sign that we see. But along with that, and kind of in conjunction with that, is the cynicism and the negativity that can come out, right? And saying, oh, the work that we're doing doesn't really matter, nothing's changing, right? All of those types of things. And then this idea of inefficacy and this feeling like it doesn't matter what I do, right? Lack of personal accomplishment. Doesn't matter what I do in this work. I can't go against this huge mountain of things that feels like it's coming at me. So those are the main signs we start seeing with burnout. With moral distress, there's a lot of kind of signs that start creeping out for people. Guilt or shame that you're not able to act on your values, feelings of helplessness and powerlessness, right? I know what the right thing is to do and I can't do it because there's things that are blocking me from being able to do it. I don't have the resources or there's policies in place that are keeping me. And that leads to a lot of this rumination around, I should have done this, or if only I could do this, right? Lots of self-doubt, having conflicts about kind of our personal and our professional values and how do those then come out to play within the workplace, difficulties making decisions, starting to question the meaning. So you can see there's some overlap with what we saw in burnout, right? Around some of this personal accomplishment pieces and the cynicism and negativity that we see in burnout, we can also see bleed into moral distress. And what we know is that while they're distinct phenomenon, that all three of these kind of amplify each other, they confound each other, and they get very intertwined. So it's often hard to pull apart and be like, what is exactly at the root kind of what's going on? Speaking up, becomes challenging. We feel like we can't speak up about things, and so we start kind of just not doing it, right? This sense of learned helplessness, and that plays into this idea of avoidance of tasks and clients and situations because we don't want to continue to feel this sense of distress, right? We want to move away from it. And then also this kind of overarching loss of trust that things are going to be able to work the way that they should be. Secondary traumatic stress, we see lots of signs there as well. We see emotional signs of people really having strong feelings about what's happening, numbing, anxiety, irritability, fatigue, withdrawal, lots of different emotional signs that may come out. Physical signs, where we're kind of somaticizing some of this, so we're feeling it in our body. So we're having stomach aches, headaches, all these different tension pieces that may be happening. Behavioral pieces, where we're avoiding certain situations, we may be really short-tempered or having more conflict with people. Cognitive, so intrusive thoughts that may start to happen for folks, changes in how we see the world. And then relational, and that can be relational at work, so conflicts that happen between teams. It can also be at home. There's been a lot of work in healthcare, for better or worse, around this idea of civility training and really training people to be nicer to each other, right? Which is great, except if you don't go and dig down underneath that and look at what's at the root of people being in conflict with each other, then you're just teaching them to be nice. They're just masking all of the challenges that they're having, and you're not really helping anybody in that situation, right? So we need to again look at what's going on, what is the awareness of what's going on for folks, so that we can make sure that we're supporting them in ways that are going to feel like they're actually supportive, and not just keep doing what you're doing, and we're not going to talk about the real problems that are going on here. So these are factors that impact secondary traumatic stress, but they also, I think, and this comes from work that Dr. Ginny Sprang did out of the University of Kentucky, but they're also things that I think impact both moral distress and burnout too, in terms of thinking about some of these. Nature of exposure is very specific to trauma, and that's looking at what's the frequency, the type, the severity, what is your trauma exposure, right, in your particular role. We also look at individual signs here, and thinking a little bit about what are the things that are going on with you as an individual that may be impacting this. We all have unique personalities, temperaments, things that are going on in our personal life, right? And those all can impact how we're reacting to the trauma exposure that we have, and how well we're online to be able to deal with moral distress and burnout as well. Socio-environmental is really looking at what's going on in the world around us, right? So what's the political climate? What's the value, as I talked about before, the value of the work? Issues like racism, discrimination, and oppression all can also come into play. I sent out in the pre-work a video by a colleague of mine, Dr. Laura Vandernet Lipsky, where she talks about kind of her own experience and talks a little about this idea of socio-environmental. So if you didn't get to check that out, it's a great resource to go back and look at a little bit about that. But really understanding about what's going on in the broader world and how's that impacting, how I'm able to show up and do my job. Current example of that, folks that are working in fields where their primary focus is immigration are very impacted by what's going on in the world right now, right? It impacts the funding that's coming into their programs. It impacts how they're able to serve clients. It impacts, what they're able to actually do for folks. It impacts the referral sources that are out there, right? So that's a good example right now that we're looking at in terms of some socio-environmental impacts on the work. And then organizational, as I said before, the type of work, how much your organization is actually doing to support around secondary trauma, or in the case of moral distress or burnout, what do they have in place that they're doing around that? And then the other conditions, right? So for secondary traumatic stress, we see a lot of impact if you are already burned out because your workload is really high and your expectations of what you need to do and the demands are really high, and there's staff shortages causing lots of that for folks. Then you're going to be more susceptible when you have a really difficult case that comes in with a lot of trauma in it to being impacted by that trauma, right? And I think that's an important piece to hold on to and to remember. And the same thing with moral distress, right? All of these things kind of compound and impact each other as well. All right, so let's look here at, all right, so this is going to be our first opportunity. Now you're going to get to stop hearing me talk for a little bit. I hope I've laid kind of enough of a foundation as we move into really looking at these strategies and we look at some of these amplification effects. But I'm going to stop talking for a little bit. We're going to put you in breakout groups. And what I want you to do in the breakout groups is look at this particular case study. And I want you to think a little bit about what are some of the signs of burnout, moral distress, and secondary traumatic stress that you're seeing in this case study. And what are some of the amplification effects that are going on here? We're going to invite you to take a quick moment to introduce yourselves when you get into your breakout groups. I highly encourage you to turn on your cameras. The breakout groups will not be recorded. So I want you to know those are a safe space to be able to share and to talk. We won't be sharing that on the recording. And they're really a wonderful opportunity to connect with your peers, and you will be in the same breakout group. We'll do this about 2 or 3 times during the session today. You'll be in the same group, so you'll get to reconnect with folks as well. So we're going to send you off into those breakout groups for about 8 minutes. Take some time, as I said at the beginning, to briefly introduce yourself, who you are and what role you are in and your organization, and then read through and talk about this. I'm going to broadcast the slide into the breakout room as well, so you'll have it there. It's also in your notes if you see it there. But it's basically about a new caseworker and some of the challenges that she's having at her organization. So you can take a moment and review that as you move into your breakout rooms, and we will reconvene in about 8 minutes or so. So let's just touch base real quickly. We don't have a lot of time to talk through this, but if anyone wants to add anything in the chat, that came from their discussion around this, specifically kind of looking at this amplification piece or any aha moments that you had in the group. I'd love to see those in the chat. While you're doing that, I'm going to move us ahead a little bit because in the interest of time, I want to make sure we get through and into the strategies, because so often we get into this awareness piece and then it's like, okay, and then what, right? We want to get there and being able to talk about this. So lots of people are saying they were able to relate to this. Yeah. Lack of support is going to amplify the secondary trauma, right? So that we see that a lot, the structural pieces that aren't in place. And I think that's what we have to remember in terms of organizational pieces is that it's not just the support after the fact, it's the design in the first place, right? That we want to have in place to be proactive as we can. There's going to be impacts when you have trauma exposure, but you can minimize how much they impact the functionality of your day-to-day existence, right? So what we don't want is we don't want things getting to the point where people are carrying things home with them and having a lot of trauma symptoms themselves. But we know that, naturally, and I want to normalize and validate that if you have trauma exposure in the workplace, you're probably going to have some impacts to it, but you want to then have things designed in a way that the supports are there for you, and that you know what to do in those situations so that it doesn't lead to getting us much further down that pathway toward post-traumatic stress disorder. Yeah, so very good answers in here in terms of folks being able to talk a little about the amplification pieces and kind of what each of these looks like individually in that situation, which was the goal of that, was to really just help you start thinking a little bit about the different pieces and being able to look at it in a case study. So the next part in here is really looking at what do we do with this awareness, right? Okay, so now we know there's these different stressors that can be happening. How do we start really kind of looking at that and what does that mean for us? And there are a lot of formal tools out there. I'm not going to share that in this particular session because they take time to complete, they take time to score. Some of them are more useful than others. Some of them are not free, right? And so this is more of an informal tool that I think can be very helpful for people to kind of take a pulse on how are you actually doing, right? And so this window of capacity framework actually comes from the work of Dr. Dan Siegel, who did a lot of work around young child and, kind of the neuroscience pieces of how does our nervous system work. And he created a framework that he called the window of tolerance. I've made a little bit of a shift in this in terms of looking at the window of capacity because we want to look a little bit more at our capacity than we want to look at what is our tolerance, right? The messaging when you hear the word tolerance is, well, you should be able to put up with it. And that's not what we want to be thinking about in this circumstance. We really want to think about what is our capacity, how are we doing in terms of that capacity, and when do we need to make changes so that we don't deplete our capacity, right? Versus you need to just tolerate what's going on around you. So here with the window of capacity framework, I think it can be really helpful for all three occupational stressors to kind of get a sense of identifying and managing what's happening in terms of what's going on in our professional lives. And quite honestly, in our personal lives, we're holistic beings, right? And so it's not like work is one life and life is another life. We're impacted by different things throughout our days, regardless of where we're at. Um, and so when we look at this, we look at this window of capacity piece being here in the middle. That's our optimal functioning. That's where we want to kind of hover in that particular area. And this is where we're feeling pretty calm and cool and connected, right? And the reality is that if we're not calm, cool, and connected, it's a lot harder for us to do our work and do it well, right? When our nervous systems are dysregulated and we're all over the place. When we dysregulate, we tend to go in a couple of different directions. We tend to either be very hyper aroused, and that's our kind of fight reaction to things where we're angry and rageful and we have outbursts and maybe we're having some impulsivity. Or we go to more of our freeze response, which is being hypo aroused. And that's when we tend to be more shut down, disconnected, and have some dissociation pieces that are going on. And so again, some of us always tend toward hyperarousal, some of us always tend toward hypoarousal, and some of us switch back and forth. And on one day we might be one, and on another day we might be another, right? And so again, this is partly where that individual piece comes in, is we have to have the awareness of kind of what are some of our tells, right? What tells us that we are kind of struggling with what we're being asked to do, whether it's around trauma exposure, whether it's around moral distress, whether it's around burnout and the kind of the productivity demands, what's taking us into these different areas. And so when we look at this, some of the common challenges that we see in these areas with trauma exposure, high doses of indirect exposure, repeated loss or threat of loss, high exposure to what we call trauma reminders. So I can, explain this to you from my perspective of what would happen to me when I was a therapist is I would have a case and it would be a young child, and most of my cases were abuse cases. So, a young child who was experiencing domestic violence in the home. And then I would have another case and another case and another case that were very similar, right? And they would all then remind me of each other. And so it was like this exacerbation of all of the trauma exposure because I started kind of seeing all these themes and trends. And then that starts impacting how you're viewing the world, right? Because then you start thinking, well, everybody's, all these kids in the world are experiencing this, right? So that trauma reminder piece can be really challenging for us. Is
And
there a
Cambria,
question,
we do
Casey?
have a question for you. So
Sure.
there is a question in the chat that says, if possible, can you go over the difference between between moral and secondary stress?
Yes. So moral distress is when you're constrained that you cannot do what you want to do because of some sort of external constraint that's going on. So that's a lot of this value conflict piece that you see in the middle of this box, which is the idea that like, I'm working with a client and I want to refer them to a substance abuse treatment, but there's long wait lists and I can't get them into a substance abuse treatment right now. Or I'm being told that their insurance will not fund for them to go to a substance abuse treatment, right? There are external constraints that are keeping me from being able to do what I think is the right thing to do with a particular client, which then feels like your values are in conflict and causes that sense of moral distress. Trauma exposure, secondary traumatic stress, is more when you are actually hearing the stories of difficult things that are going on for people around their traumatic reactions. So they can overlap, right? Because you can have somebody come to you and say, I'm experiencing, trauma exposure at home and there's no shelter for me to go to, right? And so the moral distress comes in with, I can't find the right place to get this person to safety, but I'm also hearing all this horrific thing that this particular person has been going through. So you can see how those then can kind of amplify each other. And then burnout, when we're looking at burnout, what moves us out of our window of capacity is feeling overwhelmed, conflicts with coworkers, the high productivity requirements that may be in place, right? The high demands of the job. So as you can see, any of these things can kind of be leading us to getting into either the sense of overwhelm or the sense of disconnect. The other things that come into play that aren't really characterized in this window of capacity that I want to mention is that there's also, for some people, this reaction of kind of people pleasing, right? That can happen in these situations where you start being like, okay, I'm just going to be the yes person to everybody because I want to support what's going on. And then we do what we call fawning, and that's not necessarily very helpful either. Or flight, which is when we're just like, I'm out of here, right? So all of those different reactions can kind of be having and happening. And again, it's important to identify for yourself what's going on. All right. So around awareness, we want to be thinking a little bit about how you monitor your tells, right? How do you know how you're doing, and what are some of your tells that things are not going well? And again, this can look different for different people, right? For some of us, we have very physical reactions, and when we know our stress, is coming out, we feel it in our body, and we feel different tension places in our body. For others of us, we feel it, in kind of how our view of the world and what's going on in terms of that. For other people, it's how we interact with others, right? I know when I was seeing clients, and this was back in the day when there wasn't even email, so there wasn't that type of communication that was going on. But, like I would get home after work and the phone would ring, and I'd be like, I am not answering that because I can't talk to another single person right now because they might tell me something that I then have to repair, right? And I have to help them with, and that was too much. So thinking for a minute, what are some of those signs for yourself? And if you're comfortable with it, I'd love to have folks drop some of those in the chat so we can see a little bit about that and really think about, it's important to know. It's important to be able to have that awareness for yourself and to also realize that it's not the same for everybody, right? And the reality is that we can't label somebody else's experience. We can only label our own, and we can approach other people with curiosity, right? And openness to understand what their experience is. I'm just looking in the chat here. Folks have been writing a couple things: stomach aches, short fuse, not sleeping well, checking the time, right? Having headaches, frustration, not eating. So definitely some physical pieces that come in. So you can see it's not the same for everybody as you start seeing folks responding in here. And again, really holding to that's the individual piece when we look at these things is you have to have your own awareness of what it means for you because it's not going to be the exact same of what it means for everybody else. Feeling annoyed easily, not wanting to come into work, right? For some people, it's not wanting to come into work. For some people, they come into work and then they're just what we call presentee and they're not really interacting in terms of what's going on. So yeah, lots of great explanations in here. Thank you, everybody, for sharing. And you can see as people continue to put ideas in here. So this is one of the first steps is really to identify that for yourself and know what are some of the things that give you some awareness that you're not doing well, right? And the reverse of that. What are the things that tell you that actually things are going pretty well, right? So we want to look at it from both angles. So the next piece in here that we're looking at is addressing the hazards, and this is really moving into the building skills portion of this. And what does that look like? Now, the first skill is awareness, really, right? When it comes down to it, is knowing again how you're being impacted, what's impacting you, and kind of what's at the root of that, and what does it look like for you. But we're going to go through 5 additional skill pieces here in the rest of our time together. We're going to talk about grounding and resetting. We're going to talk about transitions, self-compassion, competence, and managing trauma inputs. So grounding skills are the things that we can do really quickly to help reset our nervous system so our capacity to actually handle the distress that's going on is increased. And when we can do that and be more regulated, we can be more present and we can actually access our problem solving capabilities. Because when you're overwhelmed and you're dysregulated, you're not thinking straight, right? And you're not going to be able to do things in the way that they need to be done. And again, the reminder here around the organization is that organizational design needs to allow time for people to actually engage in these skills. Now, it doesn't need to be big 15-minute, blocks of time necessarily, but small time throughout the day for folks to be able to do this and have that white space where they actually have a moment to be able to do this. Many organizations struggle with this because people are back to back to back to back with things, right? So, as leaders, thinking a little bit about how do you infuse some of that so that people, A, have that time, and B, feel like they can actually take that time. Because we are very good at filling in our white space in our day, if we have any of it, with other things that need to get done. And we need to be able to prioritize and feel like this is an important thing to do. So, lots of different ways that grounding skills can look for folks. And again, these are going to look different depending on what works for you. For some people, deep breathing and those types of things work. For other people, it's more movement and being in touch with kind of where their bodies are in space. So you have to really, kind of dig in and look at what are the things that help ground you. If sitting and doing some deep breaths is not your thing, that's okay, right? If it's that I need to be able to get up and walk around, and that's going to help ground me. I need to go look at something in nature. That's going to help ground me. There's lots of different ways to do that. And actually, my colleague, Dr. Lisa Conradi, who does a lot of training around this, does some wonderful pieces on looking at grounding and resetting and kind of nervous system pieces. And I know she's got some wonderful trainings that she's done for CalTrin. I think she's presenting again tomorrow. But she also has some things I think that are recorded in there. So she's a great resource to look at. So what happens when we don't do this, when we don't ground and kind of reset, is we tend to ruminate. And rumination is when we have all these repetitive thoughts about either the past or the future. We are not in the present. We are everywhere except the present. And we sometimes convince ourselves that we're problem solving, but a lot of the time we don't have a focused plan. And so we're really stuck, right? We're not really problem solving. We're getting stuck in this. And so the antidote to this, when we feel ourselves getting stuck in rumination, is to engage in what I am going to call task positive activities. So in neuroscience, what we know happens when we're ruminating is that there's parts of our brain that we're stuck in that are called our default mode network. And that's where all that rumination happens, where we're really focused on ourselves and we're not focused on the present. We're thinking about the past or the future. The task positive activities are the things that we're doing that allow us to be in the present, right? So that may be listening to music. It may be taking a walk and really paying attention to what you're seeing on your walk. It could be doing a puzzle. It could be talking to a coworker, right? And doesn't necessarily mean talking to them about what's bothering you, but just talking to them, right? And having that connection around something. It's anything that you are doing that disrupts this cycle that's going on with the rumination. It is different from avoidance, right? Because avoidance is I'm not going to deal with this at all. The point of engaging in the task positive network is to break the cycle so that you can go back to things and you can do some problem solving and be able to work through whatever it is that's going on. So we're not permanently pushing things aside, but we're trying to bring ourselves back into the present focus instead of being so lost in the past and the future, right? And so this task positive activity, again, can be very quick. It doesn't need to be things that you're doing for a lot of time. And it's going to look very different, right? When I mentioned the different things a moment ago about different ideas with that, it's not going to look the same for everybody because for some people, doing a coloring page or doing a jigsaw puzzle is like their worst nightmare. For some people, going and like doing anything, exercise wise is not going to help them. It's going to stress them out more, right? So again, having that awareness of what that looks like for you and what you need in those situations. The next skill in here is about transitions. And when trauma exposure happens, we have to be able to set appropriate boundaries to allow ourselves to transition from one encounter or one task to another. The same thing with moral distress, right? When we're in a situation where we've just come out of a really difficult interaction or situation where we're now feeling moral distress, we have to have a process to bring ourselves from one thing to another. So when I told you the story in the beginning about being in the hospital with my son, this was one of the things that was front and center in my mind was I wanted to believe that those healthcare providers were transitioning from what they had come from to where they were going to be with my son so that they could really be present and focused on what his needs are. Because if you're still thinking about the last client you saw, or the last patient you saw, or the last difficult interaction that you had with somebody, and then you're going into talking with somebody else, you're going to be ruminating, right? You're not going to be into the present where you need to be. And so thinking about what do those different transitions look like for folks, and they need to happen throughout the day, right? As we're transitioning from things, I think the big piece that people get tripped up on is they're like, well, I have to have an end of the day transition. Yes, it's important to have an end of the day transition, but we can't hold everything until the end of the day. That's not healthy for us. It's not going to help us in being able to move from encounter to encounter. We have to have little things that we're able to do. And again, they can be short little things that we do. So I had one doctor that told me in the hospital that what they would do is when they left, and this was probably pre-COVID because now there's probably restrictions around doing this, and they'd have to figure out a little bit different way to do it, but they would touch the nameplate outside of the room that they had just left to leave what was going on there. And then when they went to the next room, they would touch the nameplate of the next room that they were going into, right? Very simple, piece to be able to kind of, I'm letting go what's here, and now I'm moving in to be present with what's here. It can be taking a nice deep breath in and saying, okay, I'm going to breathe in some calm and I'm going to exhale the stress that I just went through, right? Again, looking at what's going to be most helpful for you in those particular situations. So this is going to bring us to our next breakout room. This will be a little bit shorter time. We're just going to do about 5 minutes together here. But I want you to have some conversation in your breakout rooms about how you transition between tasks or between, kind of clients or whatever, in your particular role. And a little bit about how does the organization either help you or hinder you in being able to do that. So we'll move into our rooms. All right. Everybody should be returning. So again, we don't have a lot of time to process this, but if there are things that you either shared or that you heard in your room around transitions that you felt were helpful, I'd love to see those in the chat so that you can learn a little bit from the folks that you weren't in a group with. Again, a lot of this is taking the time to learn different skills and being able to see what works for you, right? And I think the more that we can share ideas and learn from each other, the better, so that we're able to pick up different ways of doing things. I can see in here scheduling your own breaks and lunch, taking your breaks, not working through them, super important, right? And I will say one of the challenges, and this is an organizational piece and a collective piece, is that if you have a lunchtime, that you talk about what happens during that lunchtime when you guys are gathered in a lunchroom together, right? Is this a safe space where we're not going to sit and we're not going to talk about all the things that we've experienced all day and we're going to talk about other things? Or is this somewhere where we're going to have some peer support that goes on? Yeah, Martha, I see you have your hand raised. Is there something you'd like to share?
Yes, I learned my lesson because before in my lunchtime or break time, I keep working. I keep working, and I say it's a break time. It's okay, I can do this. And after a couple years, I say no more, no
Yeah.
more. My boss they not appreciate what I'm doing right now. It's lunchtime. Forget it. Are you your lunch? Can you do this? I say no. This is my lunchtime. This is my. I'm gonna enjoy my lunch. Give me my time. Break time, the same thing. I can enjoy my coffee. This is my. I hope you can appreciate this one because it's me. Just like you said, when we burn out, for me, is go outside and take a deep breath because
Yeah.
I know myself. If something happened, I'm gonna explode, and you don't want to see me when I explode. And everybody say, "Oh my God!" They say, "You don't want to see that." I know my body. They say, "Marta, out now," and I can
Yeah.
tell my boss, "I'll be out." They say, "Well, I need to go out right now. Take a
Yeah.
deep breath and come back. I'm okay."
Yeah, I love that. So there's a couple things that you shared that I just want to highlight. One is you know your body, right? You know yourself. And that's so important that, again, that's that individual awareness piece, right? That we know, okay, like I'm feeling this, I need to do something different. And we have to respect that. The other thing that I think is really important is that restoring and taking the time to restore and having those moments either to ground and reset or to transition between things makes us better at what we do. Right? It's really easy to get trapped in this mindset of like, well, but if I just work more and I do more, that's the better, right? That's going to make me be a better worker. And the reality is, it's not true, right? We all need that time to be able to shift, to be able to have that break moment so that we can come back with that energy again and be able to do more. And so I really like the way that you highlighted that on here. And I see your group said you shared some great things as well. People talked about mindful minutes, using the Calm app. Yeah, so there's some great apps out there that folks can use. Having healthy boundaries ties into the transition piece as well. And then, like I think for supervisors to be able to really listen to these conversations, as somebody mentioned in here, and be able to be open to what's working for people. I've worked with many leaders over the years, doing different consultation calls around organizational health pieces. And sometimes I have to remind them because they're like, well, but if they're not doing work and they're out chatting with each other, like they're not getting their work done. And I'm like, yes, but the reality is it's important for people to have some of that restoration time. And you as a leader need to model that. And I had one leader who said to me, what I realized when I'm overwhelmed is I have to move. And he said, so what I did is I told my staff what I was doing. I was very transparent about it. And he said, and I would tell them when I get overwhelmed, I pace up and down the hallway a little bit. I walk into the conference room that has a different view from the window so I can get out of my space for a minute. And that helps me reset, right? But he didn't just do it. He talked about what he was doing, and that made it okay for other people to start identifying what were the things that they were doing. And I think that's where, again, that organizational culture piece comes in and is so important for folks. All right. This ties in well with our next piece in here, where we're going to talk a little bit about self-compassion. And self-compassion has three pillars to it. So just really briefly, the first one is self-kindness, and that's being gentle and understanding with yourself rather than immediately going to being very self-critical, right? When you encounter either pain or a failure or a challenge that comes up. The second pillar of self-compassion is what's called common humanity, and that's recognizing that suffering and failure and imperfection are part of the shared experience, right? And they shouldn't be something that isolates you. So if you are having a challenge or you're having a hard time with something, that's the time when you want to connect with other people, not the time when you should be isolating. And finally, mindfulness, which is holding your thoughts and emotions in a sense of balanced awareness, right? Without getting really tied up into any one kind of thought or emotion and without exaggerating them, without judging yourself around kind of the thoughts and emotions that you're having. Where self-compassion comes into all of this is a lot of us who are working in the fields that we're working in come into them because we are very compassionate people, right? We are very compassionate toward others, but we don't always show that same compassion toward ourselves. And so I think that it's really critical in order for us to really be able to be compassionate toward others, we have to start with ourselves, right? We have to have some self-compassion for ourselves. We need to be able to, when we're going through difficult circumstances or we have a really challenging case that we're working on, we have to be really kind to ourselves and not immediately go in and criticize, oh, I should have done this or I could have done this, or, it's very easy for us to go to the negative. And evolutionarily, that is the way we're wired, right? Because way back when our ancestors were living, in the wilds, wherever they were, wherever you're from, and they were living off the land, they had to be attuned to all the dangers that were out there, or they were going to get eaten, right? To put it very bluntly. So that's hardwired into us as human beings, is to have this negativity bias and to see all the things that could possibly go wrong in a situation. Self-compassion makes us step a little bit back from that and say, okay, yes, this was a difficult situation, but I did the best that I could in this situation, right? I also like to tie self-compassion a lot with the idea of radical acceptance. Which if you haven't heard of that term, radical acceptance is really looking at what do I have control over, right? We have to remember that we are not the controls of everything going on around us, right? People around us are going to make different decisions. The government's going to make different decisions. Our clients are going to make different decisions. Our coworker, right? We can't control what other people do. What we can control is how we react in those situations and how much energy we put toward the things that are really not in our control. So part of having self-compassion is saying, I did the best that I could given the challenging circumstances that were going on, right? We're not going to be able to fix everything that's happening. So really taking that time to be able to have some self-compassion toward ourselves is critical in being able to do this work and being able to stay healthy in doing this work. We are a lot better at, and I often say to people, think about what you would say to a friend or a colleague who is going through that difficult situation that you're going through. And make sure you're saying those same things to yourself, right? We tend to be a lot kinder and a lot gentler with other people and a lot less critical than we are toward ourselves, especially toward those that, we care about. And we need to care about ourselves. So this piece of self-compassion can help us around the trauma exposure, the moral distress, and even this sense of, burnout and being overwhelmed by things and cutting ourselves a break and saying there is a lot on our plates, right? We're not going to be able to get to everything. And that we're not the only ones who aren't doing that because everybody's trying to do more with less right now. So I encourage you to engage in self-compassion and really look at how that can impact when you're in that kind of state of overwhelm, either in hyper or hypoarousal, as we talked about before. The next area in here is competence, and competence is two different pieces. Competence is looking at intentional mastery, right? So what is it that we need to learn to feel like we can really do our jobs and do them well? And so that's kind of the individual side of it, right? Is what can we do? But it's also being part of organizations where there's this focus on learning, right? Where the doing the work is the journey, it's not the end point, and that there's always new things to learn and new skills to learn. The reality is that we are operating in a time when things are far more complicated and far more complex than they've ever been. The types of folks that are seeking out services have a lot more complicated and complex histories. The amount of information that inundates us every day is much more complicated. Now that we can access the internet and we can look things up, right? Suddenly there's a lot more information that's at our fingertips, and that can be really, really overwhelming. And so we have to really, that's where that intentional piece comes in, right? We have to really think about what's going to be most helpful for us. And then organizations need to surround that by providing the type of learning and the realization that people are learning. And that, again, there's going to be mistakes that are made. We need to learn from those mistakes, right? And sometimes there's things that just don't have very easy solutions, and we need to know what do we do in those situations, right? How do we operate in that? When I think about intentional mastery, I think about a presentation that I gave once at the hospital to a group of nurses, and we talked about this idea of competence. And I thought when I asked them about, what do you need to be more competent in? I assumed that the answer was going to be, well, in doing this particular procedure or in doing this thing. And what the majority of them came back with in the discussion was, I need to know better how to support the parents because they're getting really angry and upset. And I was never trained on what to do in those situations. And they're getting angry and upset because their child is going through something really, really difficult, right? So it's pinpointing what are the pain points in your job that make things much more difficult for you. And how do you build that sense of competence so that those things are no longer causing you to have so much effort to do them. So thinking for a minute about where you might need to build competence, right? Thinking about a challenging encounter at work, skills that you might want to access in the future. But this is something I really invite you to reflect on and think about. And folks, again, you're welcome to share, in the chat some ideas of areas that you want to build competence. Building competence doesn't mean that you're not doing a good job. It just means that you want to continue to grow and you want to continue to learn, right? And that you're aware of the areas that maybe you need some growth and some, to build on. It's also important for supervisors and leaders to have conversations with staff about this in ways that, again, encompass this idea of a learning organization. Not that we're going to shame you because you did something wrong or you don't know how to do something, but we're here to support you, right? And how different does that feel working in an organization where that's the case than being told, well, you just don't know what you're doing, and that's going to come out on your performance eval, and you're going to have to figure this out, right? We want to be working together collectively to support this idea of competence. So thinking a little bit about that, and folks are welcome to join some ideas and put some ideas in the chat. I see somebody here talking about time management, right? That's a big one. Trying to figure out, how do I balance all of this, and not feeling like you're left on your own to do that, right? That there's some support and some ways to think about that. So feel free to continue to add other ideas in here as you have them around that, but we are going to move on in the interest of time. Our next area in here is managing trauma inputs. And this is really thinking about and this is very specific to trauma exposure, and thinking about what are the trauma inputs that you have at work, and what do these look like outside of work. And the reason that I asked you to think about this a little bit is, for a lot of folks that work in trauma exposed environments, we are inundated all day with pain and suffering and difficult circumstances that people are going through. And so we need to be thoughtful about, what does that look like for us when we're not at work, right? I had a colleague that shares this story that I think really illustrates this nicely. She talked about early in her career, she was working in a college crisis center, like that was her day job. And then after work, she would volunteer to work in the prison. And that was her like hobby, right? And she said after a while, she realized that really wasn't healthy, because there was no break in that, right? There was no restoration in that. It was all go, 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 and intake, 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 all of this trauma stuff. And she realized she had to make some changes and think about, realistically, what was she doing in her off time? So again, individually, we have that responsibility to look a little bit about, what are we doing for ourselves? Organizationally, the responsibility comes in and looking at the design again, and what is the expectation that we're putting on staff in terms of how much trauma exposure there is. Now, when I worked at the CAC, all of our cases were trauma. It was, trauma all the time. But we also would do kind of this exercise of looking at, and what else might I be able to do? Like, maybe I'm going to carry, an almost full caseload, but I'm going to have a little break from my caseload so I can participate on this committee, or I can work on something around prevention, right? So there are ways within an organization to do this. It takes, again, society's value of the work and say, these are things that we're going to be willing to fund for, right? For people to do these things. But it starts with really looking at, what are those different opportunities? What does that look like within the workplace? How do we manage that? How do we manage how we distribute cases, right? So if somebody says, hey, I've got 6 kids who've got domestic violence history going on right now, I really need something different, right? I need a different type of trauma, even, just so that it's got kind of a different, or I've got all 3-year-olds and I really need to work with a couple of adults or a couple of older kids, right? So looking at, where can you provide some variation, even in terms of that, type of thing with caseloads, and being able to have open conversations about how you're being impacted by the work. So when we think about the trauma exposure that does come during the day at work, we really want to be thinking a little bit about, what do we do before, what do we do during, and what do we do after the trauma exposure. And the before piece is really kind of a more global planning of this, in terms of, you may not know exactly when you're going to be exposed to trauma during the day, but thinking through, like, okay, what is a time that I might be? And if I am, these are the types of things that I'm going to make sure that I do to prepare myself, but also to think about, what can I do during and what can I do after that trauma exposure. So the before, maybe thinking about, okay, well, during the trauma exposure that's happening, if I feel myself, I'm out of my window capacity, I'm starting to move out of that, right? What are the things that I'm going to do to make sure I can stay? And maybe the grounding pieces that we talked about, it may be self-talk, that you use to say, okay, this is a really hard moment, but I can stay here. I can be present with this, right? But we want to prepare as much as we can for how we can, in that moment, be able to stay present and do the work that we need to do with whoever it is that's in front of us that's leaning on us to provide that support. And then after, what are the things that we do to restore after that? So that's some of that transition work. It's also just thinking about, what do I do after a tough day at work? What do I do? What do I have, kind of in my toolbox that I'm going to be able to do after the fact so that I can then move into whatever I'm going next in my day, right? So really kind of thoughtfully thinking this out. So we're going to move back into our breakout groups one more time to talk a little bit about how we handle the trauma exposure. And I want you to think about some ways that you prepare, how you stay present, and what you do after a difficult encounter, right? So back in now. So again, in the chat, if anyone wants to share an idea of what they discussed around either before, during, or after, I know that was a pretty quick time to be able to have that conversation, but I'm hoping it started to give you some ideas and some time to reflect. And part of this is really being able to reflect on what have you been doing, right? And for some people, the answer is going to be, I haven't really thought about that, and I need some time to marinate and think about it. And for other people, it may be something that you've, kind of had as part of your practice for a while. And it's important to, even if you've been doing it for a while, be thinking about, is this working, right? And that's true of any of these strategies as we look at it, that things change over time. And something that may have been helpful for a while may need to look a little bit different, or maybe you've changed roles or you've changed organizations, right? And you have to kind of re-look at this. So planning before and making sure that you're actually following what you've planned, right? I think that's really important. It's really easy to say, oh, I'm going to do this, and then you get pulled in all these different directions and you don't do it. So thinking about, yeah, what do you do afterwards? I love having a dessert, right? Having something that brings you joy, whatever that may be, to kind of look forward to at the end when you know that you're going to have a particularly difficult encounter that may be happening. Having goals for every 2 months, so it forces us to change topics in our conversations, right? So looking again at how are you structuring things? What does that look like for you in your day to day? Venting, right? Being able to get thoughts out and being able to say this is hard. I think, we want to be able to move through our emotions and our, how we're being impacted by things and not hold them in. And we want to be thoughtful about how we vent. And we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. I'm going to talk about a specific way of doing kind of some of that debriefing piece, because I think debriefing is really, really important. How we do it is also really, really important. And making sure that we're in touch with that, knowing what has to get done and what can be saved for another time, right? So doing what you need to do in that time and not extending it, staying grounded and noticing when you're not mentally there. So that noticing, that awareness piece, right, again, comes back in here is so important. Journaling, yeah. So after the fact, kind of writing down what happened and being able to use that to reflect back on, and use that. What we want to do is we want to learn what works, and then how do we kind of replicate that and continue to do the things that are most helpful and are working most for us. All right, so let's move on. So that was all of our section about building skills and strategies. Now we're going to look at connection, which is our third area. And really, whoops, did that again. And really thinking about how connection supports us in all of this. So our support systems, both at work and outside of work, are really important, right? We need people who understand our work, that we can talk to about it, but we also need those people in our lives who remind us that there's more to life than what we're faced with all day at work. And that's really important, because we can grow to a point where we're like, nobody gets it. Nobody understands what my day is like because they don't do this work. And so I don't feel like I can connect with people anymore. And we need to have that reframe where we remind ourselves, but there's more than just what I'm doing at work all day, right? And that there are people who, I can go see a movie with, or I can talk about, a fun book with, or that I can go play a sport with, right? That there's other pieces to life than just what happens at work. People who have positive relationships at work feel more supported and they're more likely to reach out for help when needed. So, going back to what I was talking about a little bit earlier with the water cooler talk and my conversation with leaders, we want the people who are working on the workforce to feel connected to each other. We want them to be able to have those positive connections. So when things are difficult, they've built that level of trust and they've built that level of support so they can reach out and really connect with each other around that. And so we need to be building those connections, not just during the challenging times, but also when things are going well, right? And for some people, again, you're going to have different personalities. For some of us who are introverts like myself, sometimes I need some space, right? And I may just want to interact with one or two people at a time. And then my extroverted friends are like, everybody should get together and talk, right? It's not one size fits all. Again, awareness of what works for us, openness and curiosity to understanding how that might be different for other people. So I want to talk about low impact processing. This comes from some work that was done out of Tend Academy with Françoise Mathieu, who's one of my amazing colleagues and coworkers. And she kind of coined this term and really started using this particular way of thinking about how people debrief and how they process. I think she originally called it low impact debriefing, and then over time the name is changed. And so sometimes people still refer to it as low impact debriefing, other times as low impact processing. But there's 4 steps to it. And this works best, again, within an organization where there's some understanding of this is the process that we're going to use when there's been challenging things that we've had to deal with during the day. Whether it's trauma exposure, whether it's moral distress issues, even on occasion burnout, right? So the first step in low impact processing is to have self-awareness, right? To think about what is it I really need out of this. So I'm not just venting, but I'm consciously thinking about what is it that I need. And sometimes it is, I just need to let it out, right? And that's okay. But other times it's, I need to talk about how much this is hurting me right now, or how I don't know what to do in this situation, or how much this is reminding me of my own child, what's gone on with this other child, and that's really throwing me for a loop, right? So having that self-awareness of what is it that I want to get out of this processing session with a coworker. The next piece is fair warning, right? So instead of just plopping into your coworker's office and on a chair and just kind of emotionally vomiting and being like, blah, right? We want to give them fair warning. I just had a really difficult session. I just had a difficult encounter. I just went through a difficult circumstance as I was doing work, and I need somebody to process this with. And then you want to make sure that you get their consent. Because what happens in trauma exposed organizations is there's lots of trauma exposure going on, right? And so not everybody is at a point where they're able to be that support that you need right now. And you have to be able to accept that. And you have to also be able, when somebody comes to you, to be able to say, I'm not the right person right now. Like, I don't have the bandwidth, I don't have the capacity to do this with you right now. So again, going back to that window of capacity, knowing what your own capacity is to be able to support somebody else, really important, right? In these situations. So giving that consent and saying, yes, I can provide that support, or no, I can't do that right now. But I have a window of time later today where I feel like I might be able to do that. Or, is there somebody else that you can go talk to, right? Providing kind of that linkage support. But if that consent is there, then the next piece is really thinking about what it is you're disclosing to that person, right? We get really desensitized when we hear lots of traumatic things that have happened to people. And we forget sometimes that if we share that with somebody else, either they may not really be prepared for that because it's not something they're used to hearing. So if you're doing this like with somebody outside of work or whatever, they may not be prepared to hear about some of these difficult things, or somebody who's in a very different position at work that doesn't on the day-to-day deal with the same types of things that you're dealing with. We also know that there's a lot of other things that people are dealing with. And so we want to be careful. We don't want to put more on their plate, right, than they already have by just kind of venting and throwing everything out there. So thinking about what are the most important details, right? So let's say in this situation, I'm going to a coworker because I just had somebody, a young child, come to me and disclose something that was really disturbing to me, and it reminded me of my own child, right? So after I go through this process and I think about this self-awareness piece, what's really bothering me is that it's reminding me of my own child. So how much do I need to share with them about the details about what happened to get the support that I need, that this reminded me of my own child, right? I probably don't need to go into a lot of graphic detail. I probably can say, the child is the same age as mine. They shared some really difficult and really horrific things that happened to them. And it's put all these thoughts in my head about what could happen to my own child and what am I doing as a parent. And I need to talk to somebody about that because it's really impacting me, right? So that limited disclosure piece is really tied to that self-awareness, back to what is it that I needed in the first place, and being able to have those thought processes going on. Right. So as I mentioned with support systems, it's really important to think about what the different types of support systems that you need are. And again, it's not one size fits all, right? So I often have people really think through and reflect on these three areas. And these are not all of the areas, but it's a good start to kind of reflect on what the support system looks like for you. So thinking about, can you identify who the people are in your life that bring you joy, right? Who are the people that are there for you when you're having a pretty rough day? Who are the people that you that you can check in with when you need to talk more, when you need to do some of that low impact debriefing piece, right? So thinking about who fits in these categories. Sometimes somebody fits into more than one category, and that's fine. Sometimes it's very distinct people that fit in each of these categories for people, and that's fine, right? But knowing who your go-to people are and knowing where your areas of support are really strong, where you feel like you've got the people, and where you feel like you might need to grow, right? Where you might need more support. And sometimes you need more than just one person that fits in this area. And so being aware of that, that this is an area that is more challenging for me, or that I don't have a lot of support in, and I want to have not depend just on one person to be that support. So, taking a moment, reflecting on that. I was going to have us move into groups and talk about this, but given our time, we are not going to do that. So I invite you to reflect and to think a little bit more about that. And kind of overarching all of this as I've been talking is thinking about what an STS-informed organization looks like. Now, this again comes out of the work from Dr. Jenny Sprang, who's at the University of Kentucky, and she's done a lot of work looking at STS, secondary traumatic stress-informed organizations. I think many of these principles also apply when we think about moral distress and about burnout, but nobody's laid it out quite as cleanly in those areas that I've been able to find. So I like to use this as a starting point to then think about, how does this fit with burnout? How does it fit with moral distress as well? But the first thing is normalizing the conversations, right? Having the psychological safety that people can actually have these conversations and talk about how they're being impacted by the work. Modeling healthy boundaries, right? And making sure, people talked about that earlier, using breaks and being able to reset, building our peer support. So fostering connection through check-ins, different types of activities like compassion circles, or having a way that people are connecting. Some teams do it through potluck. Some teams do it through different types of check-ins that they do during staff meetings, right? That's going to look different in different organizations. Advocating for systemic change, right? So making sure that you're looking at what policies are out there, what supervision looks like, manageable workloads, all of those kind of system design pieces that play into this. Educating and empowering, sharing tools, trainings, but going beyond just the trainings, right? It's important that you train people and they have the foundational knowledge, but then it's looking at, how do you provide that ongoing support? Really working with people to reconnect to purpose and kind of the why and the meaningfulness of the work that they're doing, and help instill hope. And then centering equity and justice, right? And making sure that the solutions that are coming out and that you're looking at in terms of being more secondary trauma informed, as being an organization that's more responsive to supporting around moral distress and burnout, that you're really making sure that the solutions that are being brought out are being inclusive and responsive, and that people have voices in what those look like. So in terms of thinking about what your organization is doing, I just wanted to provide you with this particular tool. The Secondary Traumatic Stress Organizational Assessment also comes out of the University of Kentucky, so it's connected with that STS-informed piece that I just was talking about. And this is a tool that you can take within the organization and really look at these 6 different areas and how STS-informed is your organization. I also want to talk a little bit about the program that I've designed. So what I presented to you today are pieces from that larger program. It's not everything. There's a lot more strategies, a lot more digging into connection and really looking at the different areas of awareness. And so if you're interested in going deeper in this work, you can use the QR code, or you can go to the website that's listed here. It'll be in the chat as well. I also do a free monthly newsletter that gives different tips and tricks, and I welcome you to join the newsletter and follow the work that way as well. I'm also working on putting together some different tools for folks to use, and I welcome feedback and thoughts. As I said, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm happy to have people connect with me there and give me different feedback and ideas of where the gaps are and where things are needed in the field, because we have lots of work to do, and it's a collective responsibility and a collective really looking at what's working and what's not across different service sectors. I also am working on, so the Rise and Revitalize program itself is designed so individuals can go in and take it. It's self-paced. It's done over 12 weeks, and you get a module a week, and you get exercises and handouts and a lot of support as you're going through it. I'm also in the process of developing an organizational version so that organizations can implement it within the organization, which ultimately is what you want, because you want everybody to be working together and really looking at these issues together and reflecting on how to do this. So there's more information coming on that as well. As we close out our time today, I want you to think about one thing that you're going to try in this new week. There's lots we talked about today. So I want you to hold with that and be thinking about that. And with that, I also want to open up if there's any questions that folks have that we didn't get to today. I know there was lots and lots of information that they did share with you today. There's lots and lots more to share as well. So
Yeah.
Casey.
Yeah, we don't have any questions in the Q&A pod, but we will keep an eye on monitoring the chat in the Q&A pod. If you have any questions, please feel free to throw those in there before we end today's training. We have a couple minutes left, and so I will go ahead and have Lana drop the link for the survey in the chat. Thank you so much for being here today and interacting and taking part in the breakout rooms. And as long as you are taking part in the breakout rooms, you will qualify for the CEUs today as well. And I just wanted to thank Cambria so much for being here and giving her expertise on this very, very important topic and helping fill up our cup a little bit and giving back to ourselves in this hard work that we do every day. And so I wanted to thank you all for being here. Lana has dropped the link for you in the chat. You'll be able to open up that in a separate window, or I guess once you click the link, it'll open up a separate window and you can go ahead and head on out from the Zoom meeting today, and that link will still stay open for the survey. And keep an eye out on your email for the follow-up email today as well.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you for the incredible work that you all do. And as I said, I'm happy to continue the conversation. You have my email address here. You can connect with me on LinkedIn or through my website as well. So thank you all for taking the time to listen and to really take this seriously and think about how it impacts you. I appreciate that. I appreciate all of you.